Today, we're going to cover the amazing set of circumstances it took to make Abraham Lincoln the President of the United States. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky in 1809, but the family moved to Indiana shortly thereafter for better opportunities. The family was very poor. Thomas could barely read. He was just barely made a living farming. His mother, from whom he got his height, she died at age 34 from what they called milk sickness. A cow ate some poisonous plant, and she had the milk from the cow, and she died. Thomas Lincoln decided he needed a new wife, and so he left Sarah, who was age 12, and Abraham, who was age 9, for 3 months while he went back to Kentucky to find a wife. Sarah and Abe barely survived. They were lucky a neighbor stopped by. Back then, neighbors lived quite a ways away, over a mile, and so it was very fortunate that he stopped by and found them half-starved and saved them. Thomas returned with a new wife. She was named Sarah Bush. She had 3 kids of her own that were brought back through there, and also a trunk full of books for Abe. She couldn't read herself, but she knew that Abraham liked to read, and so she bought the books for him. It changed his life, and he became a well-educated man because of those books that she brought. Abraham Lincoln had many bouts with depression throughout his life, some so severe that it made his friends think he was going to kill himself. The most famous event happened when a friend, Anne Rutledge, died in 1835. At the funeral, Abraham Lincoln completely fell apart. He threw himself down by the grave, weeping, going hysterical. His friends had to drag him off. They had to lock him in his cabin. They took all the knives, anything sharp away. They were afraid he was going to kill himself. Now, some historians have speculated that maybe Anne Rutledge had been his lover or they were courting, but there's actually no evidence of this. There's not really any evidence that he knew her that well at all. It's just something about her that triggered this major depression to come into effect. Overall, Abraham Lincoln was haunted by death. His mother died when he was 9. His sister Sarah died when she was a teenager. He had 2 of his sons die while he was still alive, and his best friend died in one of the early battles of the Civil War. And add to that all the hundreds of thousands of men who died during the Civil War. It's a wonder he didn't go into depression even more often. Lincoln developed a true hatred for slavery. Now, part of it was some of the books he read. For example, one of his favorite books was Sufferings in Africa by James Riley, who described his time as a slave in northern Africa. But another big reason was how his father treated him. His father treated him much like a slave. He would hire him out and then to other farms to work, and then he would take all the wages. He beat him often with a belt. And as soon as Lincoln was old enough, he left, and he didn't come back. And years later, he didn't even attend his father's funeral. He kept in touch with his stepmother, but not his father. Abraham Lincoln struggled with a belief in God. In his early years, he used to mock people who were faithful to Christ. But as time went on, those mockings left, and he may have come to faith in his 40s. He is arguably our most religious president. He quoted from the Bible more than pretty much anybody else. But it's hard to say because he never did belong to a church. He often attended church, but he didn't belong to any church. Lincoln was a member of the Whig Party. That was the party that hated Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay was his hero, and many years later, a lot of the policies that Henry Clay supported in the 1830s and 40s are going to become his policy in the 1860s while he's president. During the time as a Whig, Lincoln served in the Illinois state legislature, and he was a one-term congressman from Illinois. Lincoln left politics after his one term in Congress and concentrated on his law career. However, a law passed by Congress in 1854 brought him back. It was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, what this did was it officially got rid of the Missouri Compromise and replaced it with popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty was the idea that the people could decide in the territories whether to have slavery or not, whether it was Northern Territory or Southern Territory. And because of that, Kansas, which in eastern Kansas is good for growing cotton, abolitionists started sending in people to try to make sure that it would vote for freedom. And pro-slavery people started coming in to populate it so it would vote for slavery, along with all the other settlers who just wanted to farm. And so when you have these two diametrically opposed points of view come in, it led to a mini civil war called Bleeding Kansas. And this civil war would last all the way up until and through the regular Civil War. And it also brought Abraham Lincoln back into politics in a big way. One way Lincoln came back into politics was he helped found the Republican Party in 1854. The Whig Party completely had fallen apart because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Republican Party came in and it picked up Northern Democrats who did not want slavery to expand, along with men in the Whig Party who did not want slavery to expand. And the entire focus of the Republican Party was to stop the expansion of slavery with the ultimate goal of getting rid of slavery. Another event that energized Lincoln was the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, who's on the right, was a slave in Missouri owned by an army doctor named Dr. Emerson. He took Scott with him to a fort in Illinois, which was a free state, and to a fort in Wisconsin, which is a free territory. Eventually, they came back to Missouri. Dr. Emerson died and willed Dred Scott to his daughter, Mrs. Sanford. Now, Dred was a house slave living in a town and so was sent on errands occasionally. And he came to know an abolitionist who convinced him that he ought to sue Mrs. Sanford for his freedom, on the grounds that he had lived in free areas for many years and should have been freed then. The case eventually wound its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Roger Taney was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he only had to answer one issue, whether Dred Scott was still a slave. He decided, though, to expand the case to try to solve all the controversies over slavery in the United States. Taney's decision did not actually solve anything. It just made Northerners madder and Southerners more defensive. There are 4 parts to his decision. The first part were slaves cannot sue for freedom in federal courts because they are not citizens. That is defensible. Slaves are obviously not citizens if they're owned by another human being. The second part, though, is where he starts straying into unsettled ground. He said that not only were slaves not citizens, but that African Americans could never be citizens of the United States. Now, that was just ridiculous because there were 500,000 free blacks in the United States. There were a number of states that allowed them to vote. They were considered citizens, and yet with one fell swoop, he took away the citizenship of 500,000 people. The third part was he stated that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and stated that only states, not territories, could restrict or outlaw slavery. That meant that now slave owners were free to take slaves into the northern territories. Northerners were now going to have to compete in the territories with slave owners, and if plantations were made, that used to take away a lot of opportunities for free people, and so Northerners did not like this at all. It just made things worse instead of better. In 1858, Lincoln decided to run for the U.S. Senate in Illinois against Stephen Douglas. Douglas was known as the Little Giant. He was short, only 5'4", compared to Lincoln, who was 6'4", yet Douglas was also very powerful in the U.S. Senate, which is why he was known as the Little Giant. Douglas had written the Kansas-Nebraska Act and hoped it would propel him to the presidency in 1860, but he needed to be reelected to the Senate first. The Senate was not elected by the people in 1858. Senators were elected by the state legislature. As you can see on the chart, voters elected the legislature, and the legislature would then elect the senator. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of 7 debates about the issue of slavery. They were both very good debaters. Now, these were real debates, unlike what politicians do nowadays. Debates were a spectator sport, and thousands of people would come to cheer their side. The first person spoke for an hour on the issue. The second person would reply and then speak for an hour and a half. And the first person would then reply for a half an hour. So that made for a 3-hour debate. These debates were covered in newspapers across the country, and they helped illuminate the issue of slavery. During the debates, Lincoln spoke about how the Declaration of Independence declared all men equal and that everyone should have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, even blacks. Lincoln believed that it was only a matter of time before another Supreme Court decision like the Dred Scott decision would state that free states had to accept slavery also. Lincoln wanted to stop the expansion of slavery. He believed slavery would die out if it didn't expand. Now, while Lincoln thought that the country could not remain half slave and half free, Douglas believed the opposite. He thought the country could remain part slave and part free as long as the people wanted it. This is the doctrine of popular sovereignty that he defended in every debate. When the election happened, more Democrats were elected than Republicans to the state legislature, so Douglas was reelected. However, the debates turned out very well for Abraham Lincoln. Because they were covered in newspapers all over the country, Lincoln and his ideas became well known around the country, and it's not possible that he would have been nominated for president 2 years later if he had not been in these debates, even though he lost the election. In 1859, a very divisive incident occurred when abolitionist John Brown attacked the Harper's Ferry Arsenal in the hopes of starting a slave rebellion with the captured weapons. It was quickly put down, and John Brown was sentenced to death and hanged by December. In the North, many made a hero of John Brown, and this outraged the Southerners. And the South began training their militias in case of another attack. Historians believe that this incident all but guaranteed a civil war. So this all leads to the presidential election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln was not the favorite to get the Republican nomination, but when nobody got a majority at the Republican convention, he was kind of like everybody's second choice, and he was the nominee. His platform was stop the expansion of slavery. He said he wasn't going to get rid of slavery where it was at, but he didn't want it to expand. Stephen Douglas was the popular candidate to get the Democratic nomination, but when they went to the convention in South Carolina, it pretty much turned into a riot where the Deep South did not like Stephen Douglas. The convention broke up without nominating anybody. The Northern Democrats went north. They had another convention. They nominated Stephen Douglas, and remember, he was all about popular sovereignty. Just let the people decide. The Southern Democrats, they nominated the vice president of the time, John C. Breckinridge, and he was a regular firebrand, and he wanted to expand slavery. Take Cuba, take Mexico, whatever, expand slavery. Another Democrat, John Bell, they formed their own, his group formed a different political party called the Constitutional Union Party, and they wanted to keep things the way they were. And the main reason they had that was because most of his support came from the border states, the ones right in the middle of the country, which is where the fighting would occur if a war actually happened. So this basically put one Republican against 3 Democrats, the Democrats splitting the Democratic vote. This would not do well for the Democratic Party. In the election of 1860, the Democrats split their votes 3 ways. Lincoln only won 38% of the popular vote, but he won a majority of the electoral vote. He won all of the northern states. Stephen Douglas only won 1 state outright, and that was Missouri. John Bell won these border states where Everybody was fearing that all the fighting would occur in the Civil War, and they were mostly right. And then John Breckinridge won all the Deep South states. He also won Delaware and Maryland. But when it all came up, you had Lincoln with the majority of the electoral votes. He was not even on the ballot in the South, so he couldn't have won any votes down there. And the South was outraged because somebody had won the presidency without winning a single Southern state. After Lincoln's election, many in the South decided that they did not want to be part of a nation that would elect Lincoln as president. They decided to nullify the election and form their own country. South Carolina was the first one. They seceded, and then before Lincoln was even inaugurated into office, 7 other states seceded. Once Lincoln was inaugurated, then you had 4 more states secede. That left 11 states that decided to leave the Union. Lincoln could have left them in, but let him go, but he didn't. There were 4 slave states and part of another slave state that decided to stay in the Union. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and the western part of Virginia decided to stay in the Union. So that's where we eventually get West Virginia. So by the time Lincoln took the oath of office, the country is already falling apart, and he is in the midst of a constitutional crisis.